Hello everyone and welcome to my Y&R Trends channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. The air in the opulent penthouse, usually scented with the faint, expensive aroma of polished mahogany and fresh calla lilies, had grown thick and stale, heavy with the weight of unspoken accusations and a decade of carefully curated lies. It was a silence that screamed, a palpable tension that coiled in the space between Jill Abbott and the man she had known as John B. Jabot Coleman, the man she now, with a heart full of venom and vindication, called Cain Ashby. Every line on her face, etched by years of society battles, corporate takeovers and personal heartbreaks, seemed to deepen in the dimming Genoa City twilight, each one a testament to a suspicion that had festered for far too long. She had loved him in her own fierce, complicated way. She had welcomed him into the family, had fought for him, had seen him as a son, and in return, she had received nothing but what she now perceived as a sustained, elaborate mockery. The whispers had always been there, of course, a faint, nagging hum beneath the surface of their glamorous lives. But lately, they had crescendoed into a deafening roar she could no longer ignore. The financial discrepancies, the strange gaps in his history that no one could quite account for, the way his eyes sometimes held a glint that was entirely foreign to the man he claimed to be. It was a house of cards, and Jill, with the relentless precision of a seasoned card shark, was finally ready to topple it. He stood by the grand piano, a picture of cultivated elegance, his posture relaxed, his hand resting lightly on the polished lid as if he owned the very air he breathed. This was Cain Ashby, the polished, British-accented executive, the devoted husband to Lily, the heir to a legacy he had so seamlessly inserted himself into. He was about to speak, to offer some placating, charming lie that had always worked before, a smooth deflection wrapped in a sheepish smile and a promise of clarification. But Jill was done with promises. She was done with lies. The love she once held had curdled into a pure, unadulterated rage, a fury that was cold and sharp, not hot and messy. It was this icy determination that propelled her forward, her steps silent on the plush Persian rug. Her eyes, usually alight with social calculation or maternal concern, were now twin pools of unwavering certainty. She saw the faintest flicker of alarm in his gaze, a micro-expression of panic that he tried and failed to smother with a facade of confused indignation. "Jill, what is the meaning of this?" he began, his voice a carefully modulated baritone of reason, but the sentence died in his throat as her hands, surprisingly strong for a woman of her age and stature, shot out. There was no hesitation. It was not a gentle touch, not a questioning probe. It was an assault. Her fingers, adorned with heavy, sharp-edged rings that had once signed million-dollar contracts, clawed at the space near his temple and jawline. For a split second, there was nothing but the shock of the physical contact, the violation of personal space that in their world was a greater sin than any financial crime. Cain recoiled, a strangled cry of protest forming on his lips, his hands coming up to grab her wrists. But it was too late. Her nails, manicured to a perfect, vicious point, had found purchase. There was a faint, almost imperceptible resistance, a tug against the very laws of reality, and then a sound that would be seared into both their memories forever. A soft, wet, tearing noise like Velcro being ripped apart, but somehow more organic, more horrifying. It was the sound of truth being violently unmasked. Time seemed to slow, to stretch and warp like taffy. The world narrowed to the small space between Jill's determined, shaking hands and Cain's face. Or what was left of it. Because as she pulled back, stumbling a step, a grotesque, rubbery sheath came away in her grasp. It was a mask, a perfect, flesh-toned replica of Cain Ashby's face, complete with the faint stubble along the jaw and the tiny, almost invisible scar above his brow that he'd always claimed was from a rugby match at boarding school. It was a masterpiece of deception, a horrifying work of art that now hung limply from Jill's fingers, its empty eye socket staring blankly back at the scene of its own undoing. And beneath it was not the raw, featureless flesh one might expect from a cheap horror film. No, this was worse. This was another face. A familiar face, yet one that was utterly, terrifyingly out of place. The bone structure was similar but softer. The jawline less pronounced. The skin was paler, untouched by the Genoa City sun that the man known as Cain had supposedly basked in for years. It was the face of a ghost, a man long thought to be dead, a man whose memory was a stain on the family's history. It was the face of Arthur, a peripheral figure, a pawn in a game played long ago, a man whose own identity had been so insignificant that no one would ever think to look for him here, living this grand, audacious lie in plain sight. The silence that followed was more profound than any scream. It was a vacuum sucking all the sound, all the oxygen, all the sanity out of the room. Jill stood frozen, her arm outstretched, the mask dangling from her fingertips like a slaughtered snake. Her brain, usually so sharp, so quick to process information and formulate a strategy, short-circuited. It tried to reconcile the two images, the Kane she knew, the confident, charismatic man she had broken bread with, and this stranger, this imposter, this phantom whose reveal was more shocking than any mere unmasking of a criminal. This was a violation of the natural order, a breach in the very fabric of her reality. Her eyes, wide with a terror that was rapidly eclipsing her rage, scanned the newly revealed features, the confused, frightened eyes that were a different shade of blue, the set of the mouth that was all wrong, the way the muscles in the cheeks now moved without the familiar, charming asymmetry of Kane's smile. It was a palimpsest of a person. One identity scraped away to reveal another, more horrifying one lurking beneath. And then the dam broke. The air, which had been so still, rushed back into the room, carried on the force of a sound that was ripped from the very core of Jill Abbott's being. It was not a word. It was not a sentence. It was a raw, primal, and utterly shattered scream. It was a sound of such profound betrayal, such world-ending horror, that it seemed to crack the very crystal in the chandelier overhead. Ah-ah-ha-ha. The scream tore through the penthouse, a sonic representation of her entire worldview shattering into a million irreparable pieces. It was a scream for the years wasted on a lie, for the love given to a ghost, for the family moments that were now rendered false and tawdry. It was a scream for Lily, her daughter-in-law, who was married to this thing. It was a scream for her grandchildren, who called this stranger Dad. It was a scream for herself, for the brilliant, powerful woman who had been made a fool of for so long. The sound seemed to go on forever, echoing off the priceless artwork and the floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over a city that now felt alien and hostile. In the aftermath of that scream, as the final ragged echoes died away, the scene crystallized into a horrifying tableau. Jill stood panting, her chest heaving, the mask now dropped to the floor as if it were a toxic creature. Her hands flew to her mouth, as if to physically push the scream back in, to deny the reality her own eyes were forcing her to see. Across from her, the man Arthur, not Kane, stumbled back against the piano, his hands flying to his own naked face. His expression was a chaotic mess of emotions. Sheer, unadulterated panic, a deep and profound shame, and a flicker of something else, something like relief. The burden of the lie, the immense psychological weight of wearing another man's face, another man's life for years on end, had been colossal. And now, in this most terrifying of moments, that weight was gone. He was exposed. The game was over. His hands, trembling violently, traced the contours of his own cheekbones, his own jaw, features he had not felt the air on in a decade. He looked at Jill, his eyes pleading, but no words came out. What could he possibly say? What explanation could ever suffice for a deception of this magnitude? The initial shock began to recede, making way for a tsunami of questions, each more terrifying than the last. If this man was Arthur, then who was he really? What had happened to the original Kane Ashby? The man whose identity he had stolen, was he dead? Had he ever existed at all? Or was this an even more labyrinthine lie, a Russian nesting doll of identities, where Arthur himself was just another layer to be peeled back? The financial schemes, the manipulations, the entire edifice of his life with Lily, every moment, every tender word, every argument, every Christmas morning, every birthday celebration, was now cast in the sinister light of a long con. Had any of it been real? Was there a single genuine feeling beneath the prosthetic and the performance? The very foundation of the Abbott Winters family, a clan already fractured by countless other scandals, had just been dynamited. This wasn't just a secret. It was an existential cataclysm. Jill's mind raced, a frantic montage of memories now playing in a new horrifying context. She remembered his arrival in Genoa City, the tragic backstory, the instant connection he'd forged with Lily. She remembered supporting their relationship, defending him against detractors. She thought of the times he'd comforted her, the business advice he'd given, the way he'd held her grandchildren. Each memory was now tainted, poisoned by the knowledge that it was all a scripted performance. The man she had trusted with her family's legacy, the man she had considered a son, was a complete fabrication. The rage began to boil again, hotter and more focused than before. This was no longer just about betrayal, it was about violation. He had violated their lives, their trust, their very sense of reality. He had stolen not just money or status, but their past, their present, and their future. The man, Arthur, finally found his voice, but it was a weak, broken thing, stripped of the confident British accent that had been part of his costume. The voice that emerged was higher, tinged with a different, more common accent that he had worked for years to erase. "Jill, please, you have to let me explain," he stammered, his hand still pressed to his face as if he could somehow push the mask back on and undo the last 2 minutes. "It's not what you think." The cliché of the line was almost as grotesque as the act itself. Not what she thinks. She had just physically torn his face off. What other interpretation could there possibly be? "Explain," Jill hissed, the word a venomous dart. She took a step forward, her body trembling with a mixture of revulsion and fury. "Explain what? How you murdered Kane Ashby and stole his life. How you looked my daughter-in-law in the eye and vowed to love her, all while wearing a dead man's face. How you held my grandchildren and played at being a father." Each question was a lash, delivered with the full force of her pain. "There is no explanation for this. There is no excuse. You are a monster. A thing." She looked at him, truly looked at the face that was now visible, and a fresh wave of nausea washed over her. The familiarity was the worst part. She had seen this man before, in old photographs, in the periphery of other scandals. He was a footnote, a nobody. And this nobody had orchestrated one of the most breathtaking deceptions in Genoa City history. Kane's heart pounded like thunder in his chest as he stumbled through the misty streets of Genoa City. The night air was cold and biting, slicing against his skin, but he didn't care. Panic coursed through him like fire, each breath burning as he tried to outrun what he'd just seen, what he'd just done. His hands trembled violently. His mind replayed the look in Tracy's eyes, the disbelief, the pain, the heartbreak. He hadn't meant for things to spiral this far. He never did. But somehow, the web of lies and guilt that had been closing in for weeks finally collapsed around him, leaving him with only one instinct: run. Behind him, the echoes of sirens began to wail faintly in the distance. Kane didn't know if they were coming for him, but in his mind they might as well have been screaming his name. He darted into an alley, leaning against the cold brick wall, his breath ragged and uneven. His reflection in a rain-streaked window startled him. A man unrecognizable, his eyes wild, his soul fractured. "What have I done?" he whispered to no one, his voice breaking under the weight of everything he couldn't control. "What have I done?" Across town, Tracy sat in her dimly lit living room, her eyes swollen from tears. The silence in the Abbott mansion felt deafening after the chaos that had erupted hours earlier. She could still hear Kane's voice, desperate and defensive, trying to explain what could never be explained. She wanted to hate him. She wanted to curse his name. But she couldn't, not completely. There had been love once, fragile and real, even if it had been built on unsteady ground. Still, love couldn't erase betrayal. And nothing could change the fact that the man she thought she could trust had just destroyed the last piece of her peace. Jack had tried to comfort her earlier, but Tracy had waved him off. She didn't want kind words. She wanted clarity, something she couldn't find in Genoa City anymore. Her heart was too heavy, her mind too crowded with the faces of the past. So when the night grew unbearable, she made a decision she hadn't even thought through. She would leave. For a while at least. She needed to take her son and disappear somewhere far, somewhere bright, somewhere that didn't echo with the same old pain. By dawn she was gone. The next morning the Abbott house was silent, save for the faint ticking of the clock. A note lay folded neatly on the coffee table, addressed to Jack. It read simply, "I need to find peace, Jack. Please don't worry. I've taken him with me. Tell no one where I've gone. Love, Tracy." When Jack found it, he stared for a long moment, feeling the familiar weight of family secrets pressing against his chest. He knew better than anyone how fragile Tracy's heart could be. He remembered all the times she'd carried the emotional wreckage of the Abbott family, holding everyone together while silently falling apart. And now, after Kane's latest mistake, she'd finally shattered. Meanwhile, Kane had managed to find refuge in a rundown motel on the edge of town. The walls smelled of damp and dust, the flickering neon light outside casting restless shadows across his face. He hadn't slept. He couldn't. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Tracy's tears, the look on her son's face when he realized what was happening, and the growing horror of his own choices. He tried to tell himself he wasn't a bad man, that everything he did out of love or desperation, but the words rang hollow. Even love, when poisoned by lies, turns into something unrecognizable. His phone buzzed repeatedly, messages from Jack, from Lily, from people who still thought they could reach him. But Kane couldn't bring himself to answer. He was afraid that if he heard one more voice from Genoa City, he'd break completely. He thought about leaving, really leaving, disappearing somewhere he could start over, maybe in Europe or the coast. But guilt followed him like a shadow. And then, without warning, a single text from Jack appeared on his screen. "She's gone, Kane. She took her son and left. You've done enough damage. Don't come near us again." Kane's stomach turned to stone. He dropped the phone, gripping the edge of the bed as a wave of nausea hit him. "She's gone," he muttered, barely audible. "Tracy, no." For all his mistakes, the thought of her leaving, truly leaving, was unbearable. She'd been his last connection to something pure, something hopeful. And now even that was gone. Outside, the rain began to fall again, softly at first, then harder, until the world outside his window blurred into streaks of gray. Kane pressed his palms to his face, and for the first time in years, he wept, not for himself but for the love he'd destroyed, for the peace he could never have back, and for the woman he'd pushed so far away she had to flee the country to remember who she was. Far away from Genoa City, the streets of Nice shimmered under the Mediterranean sun. Tracy stood by the balcony of a quiet seaside apartment, her son asleep inside. The air smelled of salt and new beginnings, but her heart was still heavy. She tried to smile, tried to breathe in the beauty of the French coast, but tears filled her eyes again. She had left behind everything, her home, her family, her memories, and yet, Kane's shadow still followed her, lingering like the ghost of a love she wished she'd never known.